The first whisper came on a night when I was certain the Ethereum was empty. Not just empty in the usual sense. The Historical Society had locked up hours ago. The street outside had gone silent, but empty in a way that pressed against my eardrums. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the small sounds of your body that you spend your whole life ignoring. I'd been working in this library for 6 years, first as an investigator tracking down a stolen manuscript, then as the unofficial caretaker after the archivist vanished. Everyone said he'd walked away, couldn't handle the isolation anymore. I came here to prove them wrong, to find evidence of what really happened, to show them he hadn't just abandoned his post. But on that December night, when I heard my own secret spoken in a voice like smoke and shadow, I wondered if disappearing was the only sane response. After all, the Ethereum was my sanctuary and my cage. The Historical Society had granted me unlimited access as payment for recovering their grimoire 2 years ago, or perhaps as a cautionary tale, the way you might let someone keep searching for something lost to see how long it takes for obsession to break them. The library itself was a monument to forgotten knowledge. Floor-to-ceiling shelves in dark oak that swallowed the light from my reading lamp, ladders on brass rails climbing toward shadowed alcoves, and those tall Gothic windows that let in the moon but made the darkness beyond seem deeper. It smelled of old leather and aged paper and something underneath that might have been secrets themselves, if secrets had a scent, dust and wax, and the particular chemical decay of ink slowly surrendering to time. I'd developed a ritual here. Could you arrive at 9 p.m. when the Historical Society closes to the public? Brew coffee in the small corner kitchenette that someone had wedged into what used to be a reading alcove. Return to my workspace, the archivist's workspace before he vanished, though I'd claimed it as mine over months of solitary investigation. Open my case files, arrange my research materials in precise order. The grimoire reproduction on the left, the archivist's final logs on the right, my own notes in the center. Place my phone in my bag where I won't be distracted. Then, and only then, would I allow myself to examine the evidence, searching for patterns in the archivist's increasingly erratic entries, looking for the moment when routine became obsession, when obsession became fear. The grimoire itself was beautiful in the way that warning signs often are. Each page looked like medieval illumination had collided with mathematical precision, producing symbols that seemed to breathe when candlelight hit them from certain angles. The archivist had spent his final months arguing that it wasn't just a collection of occult recipes, but a genuine codex, a complete system of metaphysical principles recorded by a Victorian-era collector whose identity remained disputed. The Historical Society had indulged him at first, then worried about him, then finally filed a missing person report when he stopped coming home entirely. The grimoire remained in its climate-controlled case, and most board members believed he'd cracked under the weight of working alone with dangerous ideas. But I'd found his journals, and in those journals, he'd documented something. Patterns in his dreams, cold spots that moved through the stacks, the sensation of being watched by something that didn't have eyes. He'd filled 3 leather notebooks with observations, sketches, his increasingly frantic attempts to make someone, anyone, understand what was happening to him. When he vanished, leaving only those journals and a desk lamp still burning, the Historical Society had quietly hired me to close the case and reassure them it was just a troubled man walking away from his life. They wanted me to conclude he'd had a breakdown, write a brief incident report that would satisfy their insurance, and move on with my life. I meant to find out what really drove him away. On the night the first whisper came, I'd been reviewing his final journal entry, a passage that had become increasingly cryptic in his last weeks. My eyes ached from deciphering his deteriorating handwriting. My coffee had gone cold 2 hours ago. I stood, stretched, felt tension release from my shoulders, and walked the 40 feet to the small restroom tucked near the main entrance. I was gone for 4 minutes. When I returned, The air in my workspace had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make me scream or run. Just shifted. The temperature had dropped perhaps 5 degrees. The shadows near the far bookshelf seemed denser than they should be, given the position of my lamp. And there, hanging in the air like a physical presence, was the smell of old stone and something metallic, like blood or rust or fear. I stopped 3 feet from my chair, every investigator's instinct suddenly screaming. That's when I heard it. Not with my ears. At least, I don't think with my ears. A voice that seemed to come from inside my own skull, from the space between my thoughts, speaking words I'd never told another living soul. You let him fall. For words. My deepest secret. The guilt I'd carried for 8 years. The reason I'd become an investigator in the first place. The night I'd failed my mentor when he needed me most. For words that no one knew, because I'd never spoken them aloud. Not to therapists or friends or late-night confessions to empty rooms. I spun toward the shadows near the shelf. They moved, not like fabric in wind or darkness retreating from light. They moved with intention, gathering and condensing, rising toward the vaulted ceiling like smoke given weight and purpose. In the center of that writhing mass, something almost like a face began to form. Or perhaps my mind was trying to find familiarity in chaos. I saw what might have been eyes, pale and knowing. What might have been a mouth, curved in something too cold to be a smile. The shadow spoke again, and this time I felt it in my bones. Tell me what you did, Elara. Tell me the cost of your silence. My phone was in my bag. My car was 50 yards away through a locked building. The main door required a key I'd left on my desk, now separated from me by this thing, this presence, this impossibility that knew my name and my shame. I should have run. That's what my training told me, what every survival instinct screamed. But I'm a professional. I've spent years tracking patterns, gathering evidence, and solving mysteries that others dismissed. And standing there, watching shadows coalesce into something that shouldn't exist, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I didn't run. Instead, I reached slowly into my jacket pocket, pulled out my small voice recorder, the one I used for case notes, and pressed record. December 9th, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. 9:47 p.m. Subject is experiencing a potentially hostile encounter with an unidentified entity. Beginning documentation. The shadow, Phantasm, I would later name it, seemed to pause. Those almost eyes fixed on me with something that might have been surprise or curiosity or hunger. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. My breath became visible in the lamplight. And then it laughed. Not a human sound. Not even close. A sound like wind through a graveyard, like whispers in a language I shouldn't understand but somehow did. A sound that told me everything I'd believed about reality, about logic, about the clean separation between the possible and impossible, was about to shatter. You think you can study me? The voice was more unmistakable now, almost conversational. Document me? File me away in one of your neat little reports. I forced myself to meet those not eyes, to keep my hand from shaking as I held the recorder. I think, I said carefully, that you're here for a reason. And I think that reason is connected to the man who worked at this desk before me. The man who vanished without telling anyone what he saw. The shadow rippled, expanding until it nearly touched the ceiling, filling the space between the bookshelves like a living darkness. My lamp flickered. The windows rattled in their frames. Every piece of paper on my desk lifted an inch, suspended in impossible wind. Oh, Elara. The voice was almost gentle now, nearly sad. The archivist understood, in the end. He understood that some secrets demand payment. That some truths, once acknowledged, can never be buried again. The shadow moved closer, and I could feel its attention like a weight, like pressure, like someone reading every thought I'd ever tried to hide. Your mentor fell, it whispered, because you weren't strong enough to hold on. Because when it mattered most, you let go. And you've spent 8 years pretending that night never happened, haven't you? building a career on finding truths for other people while running from your own. Every word was a scalpel. Every word found tissue I'd thought was scarred over. "What do you want?" I asked, and hated how small my voice sounded. The shadow contracted, drawing in on itself until it was roughly human-sized, hovering between me and my desk like a dark mirror. In its center, I could see images forming, fleeting, terrible, true. My mentor's face, the rain, the roof. My hand reached too late. "I want what I've always wanted," Phantasm said. "I want the secrets you've buried. I want the truths you've denied. I want you to speak aloud what you've never dared to speak." It drifted closer, and my legs locked, refused to carry me away. "And when you do, when you give me what I need, I will be free. Free to leave this library. Free to share your secrets with the world. Free to show everyone what Elara Thorn really is beneath all that professional competence." My recorder was still running. My heart was trying to escape my chest. And in that moment, I understood with absolute certainty that this was no hallucination, no breakdown, no trick of isolation and exhaustion. This was real, and I was in more danger than I'd ever been in my life. "No," I said, surprised by the firmness in my voice. "I'm not telling you anything." The shadow's laughter returned, colder than before. "Oh, Elara, you will. They all do, eventually." The archivist held out for 6 weeks before I learned everything. Every petty cruelty, every minor betrayal, every moment of weakness he'd convinced himself didn't matter. It circled me slowly, a predator taking measure. How long will you last, I wonder? How many nights of whispers? How many secrets revealed, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but the one truth you can't face? I grabbed my bag, keeping my eyes on the shadow, and backed toward the door. My hand found the knob. Locked. I'd locked it from the inside when I arrived, following the same routine I always did. The key was on my desk. Phantasm seemed to smile, though it had no mouth. "Welcome to the Ethereum, Elara. I've been waiting for someone like you. Someone with such a beautiful, terrible secret." The lamp went out. The darkness became absolute. And in that darkness, I heard it whisper one more time. "Let's see how long you can keep it hidden." I returned the next night with the equipment. 3 motion-activated cameras, 2 digital recorders, and an EMF detector I'd borrowed from a paranormal investigator I'd once helped with a fraud case. Professional distance, I told myself. Could you treat it like any other investigation? Document, analyze, solve. The first camera died the moment I positioned it facing the far bookshelf. Not a dead battery. The LCD screen filled with static, then went dark. The second camera recorded for 7 minutes before the footage corrupted into geometric patterns that were painful to look at. The third I never even powered on, because by then I understood that whatever Phantasm was, it existed outside the reach of technology, or perhaps it simply refused to be captured by anything as mundane as electronic evidence. The EMF detector had been useless from the start, its needles swinging wildly between 0 and maximum, with no correlation to the shadow's presence. It was my recorder, the simple voice-activated device I'd used for years, that finally gave me something. Not footage of Phantasm itself, but my own voice, speaking in the gaps between conscious thought. Should have held on tighter. Knew he was slipping. My fault. Always my fault. Words I'd never said aloud. Thoughts I'd locked away so deeply I'd almost convinced myself they didn't exist. The shadow wasn't just reading my mind. It was pulling confessions from some place beneath consciousness, recording them through my own mouth while I sat there researching, unaware that my lips were moving. I erased the recording immediately, but the damage was done. Phantasm wasn't a physical threat. It didn't need to touch me or harm me or even show itself. It was psychological warfare, a siege conducted in whispers and revelations, peeling back layers of privacy until there would be nothing left but the raw truth I'd spent 8 years avoiding. That's when I stopped thinking like an investigator and started thinking like a researcher. The archivist journals had mentioned dreams, cold spots, and the sensation of being watched. But they'd also mentioned something else, buried in his final coherent entry, a reference to collective memory, to the library itself as a repository of more than just books. He'd written about thought forms, about entities that exist because enough people believe in them, feed them with attention and fear and unspoken truths. I found the term in a 1924 anthropology text wedged between two legal histories. Tulpa, a being manifested by sustained mental concentration, given form and purpose by the very act of observation. The Tibetan monks who coined the term claimed such entities could achieve independence, could grow beyond their creator's control, and become as real as anything born of flesh and blood. But this library was older than 1924. The Ethereum had been collecting secrets for nearly 2 centuries, confessionals disguised as reading rooms, journals never meant to be read, letters sealed and forgotten. What if all those buried truths, all that accumulated shame and hidden guilt, had somehow coalesced into something aware, something hungry? The archivist hadn't created Phantasm. The library had, and I'd walked directly into its hunting ground, carrying exactly the kind of secret it needed to grow stronger. The shadow materialized behind me as I reached this conclusion, as if my understanding had summoned it. Its voice was more unmistakable now, almost solid, almost real. "You're beginning to see," it whispered. "This place remembers everything. And so will I." The whispers started small, innocuous, almost. Things I'd forgotten I'd even done. "You stole your sister's necklace when you were 12. Blamed it on the housekeeper." I was cataloging the archivist's reference materials when Phantasm spoke, its voice drifting from somewhere near the ceiling. My hands froze on a leather-bound volume. That necklace. God, I hadn't thought about that in 20 years. Maria had cried for a week. Mrs. Chun had lost her job. "You plagiarized 3 paragraphs in your college thesis. Changed enough words that no one noticed." I forced myself to keep working, to ignore it. Acknowledgement was feeding, I decided. I was given permission. But my fingers trembled as I turned pages, and Phantasm noticed. "It is always seen. You told your mentor you'd filed the safety report. You hadn't. That's why the equipment failed." My breath caught. That wasn't quite true. I had filed it, just 2 days late, after the inspection had already passed. A small lie. An administrative oversight. Except my mentor had trusted me completely, had told the board everything was in order based on my word, and when the investigation came, I'd let him take the blame rather than admit my negligence. "There it is," the shadow purred, and I could feel it moving closer, the temperature dropping 10 degrees in an instant. "The small betrayals. The little cruelties you've tucked away. They matter, Elara. They all matter." I stood abruptly, knocking over my coffee mug. The liquid spread across my notes, and I didn't care. I needed air, needed space, needed to get away from that voice that was carving out my insides piece by piece. The main door was 15 feet away. I made it 5 before the lights went out. Not gradually, not flickering. All at once, as if someone had thrown a breaker. The emergency exit signs stayed dark. My phone's flashlight activated, then died, the screen going black despite showing 87% battery a moment before. In the absolute darkness, I heard movement. Not footsteps, something else. The sound of air being displaced, warped, bent around a presence that shouldn't exist. "Where are you going?" Phantasm's voice came from everywhere now, surrounding me. "We're not finished." I pivoted toward where I remembered the door being, hands outstretched. My fingers found wood, found the handle, twisted hard. Locked. Impossible. The building's fire code required push-bar exits. I'd used this door 100 times. But the mechanism wouldn't budge, and the metal felt wrong under my palm. Too cold. Almost organic, as if the door itself had become part of the shadow's body. A sound behind me made my skin crawl. Books sliding from shelves, not falling but being removed, deliberate and slow and creating a path. The brass ladder on its rail began to move, scraping along the track with a metallic shriek that set my teeth on edge. The ancient heating system kicked on with a groan, though it was December and the system should have been running on hot air. Instead, I felt cold pouring from the vents, arctic and wrong. Phantasm was learning. It wasn't just psychological anymore. It could manipulate the physical space, bend the library's century-old infrastructure to its will. The building itself was becoming an extension of the entity, responding to its hunger, helping it trap me inside. "You can't lock me in here," I said, hating the quaver in my voice. The shadow laughed, that sound like whine through empty crypts. "I'm not locking you in, Elara. I'm keeping the world out. Here, in the dark, it's just us. Just you and every secret you've ever buried." The lights surged back on, painful and sudden. I was no longer standing by the door. I was in the center of the room, surrounded by a perfect circle of fallen books, like I'd been moved while blind. And Phantasm stood before me, more solid than it had ever been, its almost face inches from mine. "Tell me about the roof," it whispered. "Tell me about the rain." I found the fourth journal by accident, or perhaps Phantasm wanted me to see it. Wedged behind a loose panel in the desk drawer, wrapped in oilcloth like something precious or dangerous or both. The archivist's handwriting on the cover, neat at first, then deteriorating into frantic scrawls. "Private. Do not read. Burn this." I read it anyway. What choice did I have? The early entries were mundane: catalog updates, acquisition notes, observations about the grimoire's provenance. But around entry 30, dated 6 weeks before his disappearance, the tone shifted. He'd started hearing whispers, feeling watched, finding objects moved when he was certain he'd left them elsewhere. "It knows about Rebecca," he'd written. How could it possibly know about Rebecca? I turned pages, my hands unsteady. The entries grew more desperate. He'd tried leaving, tried working from home, but the whispers followed him. They were loudest in silence, clearest in darkness, most invasive when he tried to sleep. Small secrets at first, money he'd borrowed and never returned, a colleague's idea he'd claimed as his own. Then the larger ones. An affair, a daughter he'd never acknowledged. His father's connections covered up a drunk driving incident. "It's feeding on shame," he wrote in a passage underlined 3 times. "The more I resist, the deeper it digs. It doesn't want information. It wants the feeling of exposure, the psychological cost of having buried these things in the first place." Further in, he'd sketched theories, tulpas, thought forms, egregores, entities sustained by collective belief and emotional energy. The Ethereum had been a private gentleman's club in the 1800s, a place where wealthy men came to confess indiscretions, secure favors, and trade secrets that could destroy reputations. What if all that hidden guilt, all those whispered admissions, had accumulated like sediment? What if the building itself had become saturated with shame, until that shame achieved consciousness? I tried to bargain with it, he wrote, his handwriting barely legible now. Offered to tell someone, anyone, to make the secrets public myself. But that's not what it wants. It doesn't want a confession. It wants the agony of keeping secrets while being forced to acknowledge them. It wants us to know that it knows, to live in that space between silence and revelation. That's where it feeds. The entries became fragments. Dates skipped. Whole pages torn out. Then, 3 pages from the end, a lucid passage that made my blood run cold. Tested a theory tonight. Told the shadows something true, something painful, but something I'd already forgiven myself for. It recoiled, grew weaker. The entity doesn't feed on truth itself. It feeds on the lie we tell ourselves that the truth doesn't matter. It needs our denial, our self-deception, the energy we spend pretending we're not carrying these burdens. Without that internal dishonesty, without that gap between what we know and what we admit, it has no purchase. My breath came faster. I flipped to the final entry, dated the night he vanished. The handwriting was almost calm, resigned. Just 4 sentences that I read 3 times, memorizing every word. I understand now. It doesn't want the grimoire. It never wanted the book. It wants the cost of the lie, the price we pay for burying our truth so deep we almost believe our own deception. The grimoire was just bait, a reason to keep us here long enough to break us down. I won't give it what it wants. I'd rather disappear. The journal ended there. No signature, no farewell, just those words and blank pages after, as if his story had stopped mid-sentence. Behind me, the air shifted. I didn't need to turn around to know Phantasm was there, reading over my shoulder, savoring my realization. He was so close, the shadow whispered. But understanding isn't the same as accepting. He ran before he could face the real question. What happens when you stop lying to yourself, Elara? What's left when the performance ends? I closed the journal carefully, my mind racing. The archivist had found the weakness. Truth divorced from shame. Confession without self-punishment. But he'd run before testing it thoroughly, before discovering if the theory could actually break Phantasm's hold. I wouldn't make the same mistake. Show me, I said quietly, surprising myself. Show me what you think I'm lying about. Understanding the mechanism wasn't the same as defeating it. I realized this at 3 a.m. when panic finally overrode analysis, and I ran. Not toward the main door this time. Phantasm had proven it could seal that easily enough. But the Ethereum had a service entrance, a narrow passage behind the preservation room that led to an alley. Staff access only. The archivist would have known about it. Maybe that's how he'd finally escaped. I moved fast, abandoning my research, my equipment, everything, just my keys and my phone and the desperate need to be anywhere else. The preservation room door opened smoothly, too smoothly, as if something wanted me to proceed. Red flag. Every instinct is screaming. But I went anyway because the alternative was staying, and staying meant letting Phantasm continue its excavation of my psyche until there was nothing left but exposed nerve endings. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for my shoulders. Emergency lighting cast everything in sickly yellow. My footsteps echoed wrong, like the space was larger than it appeared, or smaller, or folding in on itself in ways that architecture shouldn't allow. 50 feet. That's all it should have been, 50 feet to the exit. I walked for what felt like 5 minutes. The walls started to shimmer at the edges of my vision. Not melting, not warping, but becoming reflective, like the plaster had been replaced with dark glass. I could see myself multiplied, repeated, stretching into infinity on both sides. Dozens of Elaras, hundreds, all walking toward an exit that never seemed to get closer. Then the reflections began to change. The Elara on the right, nearest to me, started to blur, her features softening like wax under heat. I watched, transfixed and horrified, as her face lost definition, became smooth and featureless. Her body followed, edges dissolving, substance leaking away until she was barely a silhouette, a ghost of intention with no solid form beneath. This is what guilt does. Phantasm's voice surrounded me, came from the walls themselves. It erodes. It hollows. You've spent 8 years performing the role of competent investigator, haven't you? Playing at being whole while the truth eats you from the inside. Another reflection dissolved, this one on my left. Then another. The dissolution was spreading, moving closer to my actual position in the corridor. I spun, looking for the door I'd entered through, but there was only more passage, more mirrors, more versions of myself coming apart at the seams. You think you can leave? The shadow materialized in front of me, blocking the path forward. Solid now, more real than it had ever been. Its almost face settling into features that looked disturbingly like my own. You think geography matters? You carried your secret into this library, Elara. You've carried it everywhere for 8 years. Distance won't help. New cities won't help. Different jobs, different relationships, different versions of yourself. None of it helps because you take the lie with you. I pressed my back against the wall, against the mirror, and felt it give slightly, as if the surface were a membrane instead of glass. Behind me, my reflection was dissolving faster now, face melting into abstraction, and I could feel it. Actually feel the erosion like parts of my identity were being peeled away. The archivist ran. Phantasm said softly. Found this same passage. Saw this same vision. You know what he realized? I couldn't speak. Couldn't move. I was watching myself disappear in real time, and some part of me recognized the metaphor made literal. This was what I'd been doing all along, slowly erasing myself under the weight of unacknowledged guilt. He realized there is no exit, the shadow whispered. Not from this library. Not from your guilt. Not until you stop running. The only door that opens is the one you've been sealing shut inside your own mind. The corridors snapped back to normal, so suddenly I staggered. Regular walls. Regular lights. The exit door is 10 feet ahead, unlocked and achievable. I could see the push bar clearly and the moonlight through the small window. But I didn't move toward it. Because Phantasm was right. I could walk through that door, drive away, never return. The shadow wouldn't follow. It was bound to this place, to the accumulated shame embedded in the Ethereum's foundation. But my guilt would follow. It always had. And I was tired, so desperately tired, of running from a truth that lived inside my own skull. I turned to face the shadow fully. Show me the roof, I said. Show me what really happened. All of it. The shadow who knew my secrets. Chapter 6. The library rearranged itself around us. Books slid from shelves and stacked themselves into crude amphitheater seating, creating a circle with me at its center. The Gothic windows darkened despite the moon outside, as if the glass had been replaced with obsidian. Every lamp in the Ethereum ignited at once, their combined light harsh and surgical, leaving no shadows anywhere except the one standing before me. Phantasm had stopped pretending to be formless. It wore a shape now, almost human, built from the collective weight of every secret ever whispered in this building. I could see faces in its surface, the archivist, people I didn't recognize, fragments of confession and shame layered like geological strata. And somewhere in that mass, I saw my own face looking back, younger, terrified, reaching for something that was already falling. You want to know what I am? It said, and its voice had changed too. No longer the whisper from shadows, but something clearer, almost resonant, like a church bell cast from grief. I am what this place was always meant to create. For 200 years, men came here to bury their truths. They thought confession would set them free, but they lied even in their admissions, held back the worst parts, kept the real guilt locked away. All that buried shame had to go somewhere. Elara. It accumulated. It fermented. It became aware. The entity moved closer, and I could feel the temperature drop. But this time there was something else beneath the cold, a terrible kind of hunger that wasn't about consumption but completion. I am the Ethereum's truth, Phantasm continued. The confession this building has been waiting centuries to hear. Every secret it has absorbed, every lie it has witnessed, they all feed me, strengthen me, but they're fragmented, incomplete. I need more than whispered admissions in the dark. I need someone to speak their deepest truth aloud, to give voice to the guilt they've buried so deep they've almost convinced themselves it doesn't exist. It extended something like a hand toward me, and where it touched the air, reality rippled, showing me glimpses of what lay beyond the library, streets, homes, the entire city sprawling in the darkness. My city, where I'd built my reputation, my life, my carefully constructed identity as someone who solved problems instead of creating them. I'm trapped here, the shadow said, and for the first time, I heard something that might have been frustration. Bound by the same walls that contain all these buried secrets. But you, Elara, you carry the exact kind of truth I need. Complete. Painful. The kind that's been eating you alive for 8 years. The kind you've never spoken aloud because saying it would make it real in a way you can't bear. The vision beyond the library expanded. I saw my apartment, my office, my sister's house, where I hadn't visited in months, because being around family meant risking questions I couldn't answer. I saw the cemetery where my mentor was buried, the headstone I'd paid for but never visited. "Tell me about the roof," Phantasm whispered. "Tell me the whole truth. How you promised him you'd check the safety equipment, how you forgot. How you were too proud to admit the mistake when he was already up there, trusting you, believing the harness was rated for his weight because you'd told him it was. Tell me how you watched him fall and knew, absolutely knew, it was because of your negligence." My throat closed. My eyes burned. Every word was accurate and more devastating than I could stand. "Tell me how you let the investigators blame equipment failure instead of human error. How you accepted their sympathy, their reassurances that it wasn't your fault, when you knew, you have always known, that if you'd done your job, checked that one certification number, he would still be alive." The shadow's form expanded, filling my field of vision, becoming everything. "Give me that confession, Elara. Speak it aloud. Here, in this place built to absorb truth. Let me have the full weight of your guilt, the complete story, and I will have enough power to break free. Enough to become real beyond these walls." It leaned closer, and I could see my mentor's face in its surface now, accusing and sad. "And in exchange, I will give you silence. No more whispers. No more excavation. I'll take your secret with me when I leave, and you can go back to pretending you're someone worthy of the life you've built on his grave." The offer hung between us like a blade. "All you have to do," Phantasm said softly, "is tell the truth." I didn't answer Phantasm's demand. Not that night. Instead, I walked back to my desk while the shadow watched, patient and confident, convinced I would break eventually. They all did, it had said. The archivist had lasted 6 weeks. How long would I last? Long enough, I hoped, to find another way. The grimoire sat in its climate-controlled case, locked behind glass that had survived 2 centuries. I'd always assumed it was secured because of its value. A rare Victorian occult manuscript, leather-bound, allegedly containing summoning rituals and alchemical formulas. The Historical Society treated it like its crown jewel, the anchor of their collection. But what if that wasn't why it was locked away? I broke the case at 4 in the morning, using a letter opener in the desperation of someone who'd run out of options. The alarm didn't sound. Phantasm had turned off the building's systems days ago, isolating me more completely than any lock could manage. My hands trembled as I lifted the cover, half expecting something dramatic. A surge of power, a rush of forbidden knowledge. Instead, I found meticulous documentation. Not spells, not incantations. Instructions. Procedures written in Victorian English, precise and clinical, describing methods for containing and neutralizing what the author called incorporeal manifestations of collective psychic energy. Sealing rituals, binding ceremonies, ways to trap entities that existed purely as thought made manifest. The author, a doctor, judging by the terminology, had encountered something similar to Phantasm in 1847. A presence in the Ethereum's original building, back when it was still a private club. He'd watched it grow stronger, feeding on the secrets wealthy men brought through the doors. He'd tried confession, tried purification, tried every religious remedy available. Nothing worked because the entity wasn't demonic. It was psychological, sustained by human shame and self-deception. What finally trapped it was the paradox. The doctor had given the entity a truth that was simultaneously complete and incomplete, a confession that satisfied its hunger while offering no actual sustenance. He'd admitted to something real, something painful, but had framed it in a way that prevented the entity from using it, from drawing power from the gap between acknowledgement and acceptance. I read the passage 3 times, my mind racing. The doctor had confessed to causing his brother's death, but had done so while explaining, in excruciating detail, why he'd already forgiven himself, why the guilt no longer had power over him, why the truth was simply a fact rather than a wound. The entity had fed, grown momentarily stronger, then collapsed inward, starved despite being given exactly what it demanded. Truth divorced from shame. Confession without self-punishment. The same principle that the archivist had discovered, but weaponized. Could I do the same? Could I confess without actually giving Phantasm what it needed? No. My guilt was too raw, too real. I hadn't forgiven myself. I couldn't stand in front of that entity and speak about my mentor's death with clinical detachment. The moment I started talking about that night, about my failure, I would break. And Phantasm would have everything. But what if I didn't confess to that? What if I gave it something else? Something that felt equally devastating, equally true, but was actually constructed? A lie so perfect, so believable, so close to the architecture of my real guilt that even an entity built to detect deception might mistake it for truth? I spent the rest of the night building it. Layer by layer, detail by detail. A false memory woven from real emotions. A fictional betrayal that borrowed the shape of my actual shame, but changed the specifics enough to make it useless. The story went like this. I would confess that I'd sabotaged a rival investigator's career, planted false evidence, destroyed her reputation out of jealousy and ambition. I would describe it with the same remorse I felt for my mentor's death, the same sleepless nights, the same corrosive guilt. I would make it personal, devastating, complete. I would even cry. God knows I had enough genuine grief to draw from. And if Phantasm accepted it, if it fed on that confession and tried to break free using that power, it would find nothing but narrative instead of truth. Empty calories. A meal that looked substantial but provided no nourishment. The entity would realize, too late, that it had been given exactly what it asked for, a complete, painful confession, but one that led nowhere, that contained no actual bridge between my psyche and its hunger. By dawn, I had every detail memorized. The rival's name, Sarah Chun, borrowing from the housekeeper I'd wronged as a child. The case we'd competed over. The specific evidence I'd planted. The moment I'd watched her career collapse, knowing I was responsible. It was perfect, believable, devastating. It was a lie wrapped in emotional truth, and I prayed it would be enough to trap something that had spent 2 centuries learning to taste the difference. I called Phantasm to me at noon, when daylight should have made me feel safer, but only emphasized how little safety mattered against something that existed outside the rules of physical reality. The entity materialized slowly, almost cautiously, perhaps sensing something had changed in me. The fear was still there. I couldn't fake its absence, but underneath it ran a current of determination that hadn't existed before. "I'm ready," I said, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. "I'll give you what you want. The confession, the complete truth." The shadow contracted, focusing its attention with an intensity that made the air vibrate. I could feel its hunger, its anticipation, 2 centuries of accumulated need pressing against my resolve like water against a dam. I began speaking. "Sarah Chun, the case, the planted evidence." I gave Phantasm everything I'd constructed, every detail I'd spent the night perfecting. I let my voice crack in the right places, let tears come, real tears drawn from real guilt, just aimed at a fictional target. I confessed with the full weight of my shame, holding nothing back, giving the entity exactly what it had demanded. For a moment, Phantasm seemed to accept it. I watched the shadow grow more solid, more real, feeding on what it thought was my most profound truth. It expanded toward the ceiling, reaching for the windows, for the world beyond the Ethereum's walls. Then it stopped. The entity's form flickered, stuttered, like a film reel catching on damaged frames. The almost face that had been settling into features twisted and distorted, becoming something animalistic and furious. I felt the temperature plummet so fast that frost formed on the windows, on the bookshelves, on my skin. "No." The word came from everywhere at once. not spoken but manifested, carved into reality by pure rage. Phantasm contracted violently, then exploded outward, its form expanding to fill the entire library. No longer almost human, no longer pretending its civility. It became what it truly was, a massive, writhing manifestation of accumulated shame and fury, tendrils of darkness lashing out to destroy anything solid, anything real. You dare? The voice was thunder and breaking glass and screaming metal. You think you can deceive me? Me? I am truth itself. A bookshelf exploded, centuries-old volumes bursting into fragments. The Gothic windows cracked, spiderweb patterns racing across the glass. The floor beneath my feet buckled, ancient boards shrieking as they warped. Phantasm had stopped trying to be subtle, stopped pretending the library's physical form bound it. It was tearing the building apart from the inside. He trusted you. The shadow's voice found words again, each one a physical blow. Your mentor trusted you with his life, and you were too careless, too proud, too wrapped up in your own importance to do your job. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The entity was everywhere, surrounding me, above me, its massive form pressing down like the weight of guilt made manifest. You told him the equipment was rated. You promised him you'd check. And when he fell, when he screamed your name, you stood there and watched him die knowing it was your fault. The ceiling cracked. Plaster rained down. The brass ladder tore free from its rail and crashed into a reading table, splintering wood that had survived 200 years. Every light in the Ethereum burst simultaneously, glass showering down in a glittering rain. You let the investigation clear you. You attended his funeral and accepted condolences from his wife. You built a career on competence while hiding the fact that your incompetence killed the only person who believed in you. Phantasm's form solidified above me, becoming the image from my nightmares, a towering presence of writhing shadow and reaching tendrils, massive and terrible and absolutely focused on destroying me for daring to lie to something that existed solely to expose lies. Did you think I couldn't taste the difference? The entity's voice dropped to something almost intimate, almost sad. I am every buried secret in this building. I am 2 centuries of self-deception given consciousness. You cannot fool me with performance, Elara. You cannot trick me with false confessions. A support beam cracked with a sound like gunfire. The second-floor gallery began to list, books sliding from shelves in cascading avalanches. The Ethereum was coming down around us, and Phantasm didn't care. If it couldn't break free, it would destroy everything, including itself, including me. Give me the real truth, the shadow screamed, or we both die here. I fell to my knees amid the debris, and something inside me finally broke. Not my will, not my determination. The wall I'd been building for 8 years, brick by careful brick, between who I was and what I'd done. Yes, I said, and my voice came out barely a whisper, but Phantasm heard it. The destruction paused. The entity contracted slightly, focusing on me with terrible attention. Yes, you're right. All of it. Every word. I wasn't speaking to the shadow. Not really. I was talking to myself, to the part of me I'd been running from since the night Daniel fell. I told him the harness was rated for his weight. I'd been meaning to check for weeks, but there was always something more urgent, more interesting. I was 26 and brilliant and so goddamn sure of my own competence that the idea I could make a mistake, a real, fatal mistake, never occurred to me. The words came easier now, terrible and freeing at once. Phantasm loomed above me, but I wasn't looking at it anymore. I was looking at my own hands, remembering how they'd shaken when I'd finally checked that certification number 2 hours after the ambulance left. He called my name when the bolt failed. He was falling, and he called my name. He thought I could fix it because he trusted me to have done everything right. And I just stood there, frozen, watching someone I loved die because I'd been too careless to do my job. My chest ached. My throat burned. But I kept going. I let them blame equipment failure because I was scared. Scared of losing my license, my reputation, my future. I let his wife thank me for trying to save him. I spoke at his funeral about his mentorship while knowing I'd killed him through negligence. Phantasm's form flickered, and I felt something shift in the air between us. I built a career on being thorough, being careful, being the one who catches what everyone else misses, and it's all been penance. Every case I solve, every detail I don't overlook, every time I triple-check something obvious, it's all me trying to balance scales that can never be balanced. I looked up at the shadow then, tears streaming down my face, and said the words I'd never let myself even think. And I forgive myself. The entity recoiled as I'd struck it. Not because I deserve forgiveness. I continued, my voice stronger now. Not because what I did wasn't terrible, but because carrying this guilt hasn't brought Daniel back. It hasn't made me a better person. It's just hollowed me out, made me perform competence instead of living it, made me build walls instead of connections. Phantasm was shrinking, its massive form contracting violently. I was 26 and careless and human, and someone died because of it. That's the truth. That's what happened. And I'm going to carry it for the rest of my life. Not as a secret, not as shame, but as a fact. A terrible fact that shaped me, but doesn't define me. The shadow's almost face appeared one final time, and I saw confusion there, or perhaps something like betrayal. It had been given exactly what it demanded: complete confession, raw truth, devastating admission, but without the self-deception that gave it power. Without the gap between acknowledgement and acceptance, without the poison of buried shame. I'm sorry, Daniel, I said quietly, and meant it. I'm so sorry, but I can't spend the rest of my life dying alongside you. Phantasm screamed, a sound like reality tearing, and collapsed inward. Not destroyed. I could still feel its presence, still sense its hunger, but diminished, weakened, forced back into the shadows that had birthed it. The library stopped crumbling. The temperature rose. The destruction halted mid-collapse, leaving the Ethereum damaged but standing. The entity's voice came one last time, distant now, receding into the deep darkness between the shelves. You think this changes anything? The guilt remains. The truth remains. I remain. I know, I said, standing on shaking legs. But I'm not running from it anymore. And without my denial to feed on, you're just another shadow in a dark room. The presence withdrew completely, leaving behind only silence and wreckage and the first breath of freedom I'd taken in 8 years. I wasn't healed, wasn't absolved, but I was, finally, honest. With myself, with the memory of my mentor, with the truth I'd buried so deep, it had taken a manifestation of accumulated shame to excavate it. The Ethereum's front door unlocked with an audible click, the mechanism releasing as if the building itself was letting me go. I walked toward it slowly, gathering my things, leaving behind the case files and research and the grimoire that had shown me the way out. At the threshold, I looked back one final time at the damaged library, at the shadows that still moved in its depths. I'll be back, I told them, to close this case properly, to find out what happened to the archivist. But on my terms now, not yours. The shadows didn't answer. They didn't need to. We both knew the nature of our relationship had changed. Phantasm would always be there, would always hunger for buried truths and self-deception. But it no longer had a hold on me. I stepped out into December sunlight, and for the first time in 8 years, the weight I'd been carrying felt bearable.